The man accused of killing the California college student 25 years ago appeared in court today for an arraignment. Paul Flores and his father Ruben entered not guilty pleas today. Prosecutors say Paul killed Smart in 1996 while trying to rape her in his college dorm room. His father Ruben is accused of helping hide Smart's body. A judge ruled Paul will remain in jail without bail.
The voicemail was 30 seconds long. Kristin Smart had recorded it on a Friday afternoon in late May 1996, standing somewhere on the California Polytechnic State University campus in San Luis Obispo, her voice carrying the particular lightness of someone whose week had just turned. She told her parents she had good news. She said she would call them Sunday. Sunday came. The phone did not ring. By Monday morning, Denise Smart had played the voicemail back twice. By Tuesday, she had lost count. The voice on the recording was so ordinary, so firmly planted in the normal mechanics of a 19-year-old's life, that listening to it again and again began to feel less like comfort and more like a question that kept refusing to answer itself. Her daughter had vanished somewhere between a party and a dormitory door. The distance between those 2 points was 40 yards. Before we go any further, drop your location in the comments. I want to know where you are watching this from. And tell me, at this point in the story, does 40 yards sound like a long way to you? Because by the end of this, your answer might change. Kristin Smart stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, with long dark hair and the kind of straightforward, unhurried confidence that made people feel comfortable around her without knowing exactly why. She had grown up in Stockton, California, the only child of Stan and Denise Smart, a family that kept to itself more than most, that expressed affection in practical rather than dramatic ways. Stan was former military, measured, and deliberate. Denise kept photographs on every surface of the house. Kristin's face looked out for most of them. She had not found college easy. The coursework was harder than she had anticipated, and the focus it required sat uncomfortably with the way her mind moved. Fast in some directions, resistant in others. She worked as a lifeguard on the side to cover her expenses. She had considered leaving Cal Poly more than once. She had decided, for reasons she did not fully explain to her parents, to stay. The good news she had mentioned in the voicemail was a makeup exam opportunity, a chance to recover a grade that had been pulling her down all semester. It was the kind of second chance that feels, at 19, like the beginning of something rather than the closing of anything. She went to a party that Friday night on Crandall Way, a few blocks from campus. She brought no wallet, no ID, no plan beyond the casual geography of a long weekend. None of that registered as significant. It was Memorial Day weekend. Students moved between gatherings in loose groups, the whole campus softened by the nearness of summer. 3 people walked her back toward Muir Hall in the early hours of Saturday morning. 2 of them peeled off toward their own residences before they reached the dormitory. One of them continued walking alongside her. His name was Paul Flores. He was 21, a fellow freshman despite the age gap, stocky and physically confident. He had not been asked to escort her. He had inserted himself into the group. He would later say he had watched her walk the last stretch to her dormitory door on her own, that she had seemed fine. The dormitory entrance was staffed that night. Nobody saw Kristin Smart come through. Her room key was inside her room. Her bed had not been slept in. Paul Flores went home and slept. By the time anyone started asking questions, he had already had 2 full days to think about what he was going to say. The first official response to Kristin Smart's disappearance was not a search. It was a theory. Campus police, the first agency to receive word that a student had not returned to her dormitory, reviewed the circumstances and arrived at a conclusion that would define the early weeks of the investigation in ways that proved nearly impossible to undo. Their conclusion was that Kristin Smart had probably left campus voluntarily. It was Memorial Day weekend. Students did that. The question of how she might have left, given that she had no money, no identification, no packed belongings, and no contact with any friend or family member, did not significantly alter the theory. One version of events floated through the early days of the inquiry with a confidence that no evidence supported. She had gone to Hawaii. She had no means to travel anywhere. The people closest to her had not heard from her. But the Hawaii theory circulated through the initial handling of the case, as though saying it enough times might eventually make it plausible. Her friends were not satisfied. They had known Kristin well enough to understand that a makeup exam opportunity does not get abandoned for a spontaneous trip to the Pacific. They pushed. The resident advisor told them to wait. Campus police told them to wait. The official machinery of the university's safety infrastructure looked at the situation and decided it required patience rather than urgency. For days passed before a formal missing person report was filed with local law enforcement. In a case involving a young woman last seen in the company of a specific individual in the early hours of the morning, the first 72 hours are when physical evidence is still intact, when witness memory is still fresh, when a person who might have information has not yet had time to build a story and practice telling it. 4 days is not a delay. 4 days is a window that closes and does not reopen. Paul Flores had been identified almost immediately as the last person to have seen Kristin Smart. That was not in dispute. He had walked her back. He had been alone with her for the final portion of that walk. When investigators eventually got around to sitting down with him, days after the missing person report, days after that window had already narrowed, his physical appearance had changed. He had a black eye. He had scratches on his face and arms. He said he had hurt himself playing basketball. Nobody had photographed his injuries when they were fresh. Nobody had secured his dormitory room. Nobody had collected or preserved the clothing he had been wearing that Friday night. Nobody had formally tested the explanation against what anyone else remembered seeing or hearing in the 48 hours after the party on Crandall Way. There was one more detail that investigators documented and then, for reasons that were never fully explained, did not pursue immediately. In the days following Kristin's disappearance, multiple people in Flores' social circle noticed the injuries. Several of them asked him directly what had happened. His explanation shifted. Not dramatically, not the kind of shift that registers as an obvious lie, but in the way that small details shift when someone is constructing a story rather than recalling one. The basketball injury became 2 separate basketball incidents. The timing changed. The inconsistencies were noted. The investigation moved on anyway. Investigators had a suspect with visible injuries, changing stories, and no alibi that anyone could confirm. What they did not have was a sense of urgency. And urgency, in a case like this, is the one thing that cannot be recovered once it is gone. The case did not go cold because the evidence ran out. The case went cold because the evidence was never properly gathered in the first place. The investigation into Kristin Smart's disappearance unfolded against a backdrop of institutional decisions that, taken individually, each had a plausible explanation. Campus police deferred to local law enforcement. Reasonable, given their limited jurisdiction. Local law enforcement operated without the forensic resources available to larger agencies. Also understandable in a county of that size in 1996. Witnesses were interviewed in the days and weeks following the disappearance, but the interviews were not recorded, not comprehensive, and not followed by the kind of sustained contact that keeps a case alive in the minds of the people who might know something useful. What emerged, in place of a focused investigation, was a picture built around the victim. Had Kristin been drinking the night she disappeared? How heavily? What was her history on campus? Had she been in trouble before? Was she the kind of person who might leave without telling anyone? These were the questions that shaped the early investigation, and they were questions that looked outward from Kristin Smart and not toward the man who had been walking beside her when she vanished. Paul Flores was interviewed. He was not arrested. He was not treated as a suspect in the formal legal sense that would have permitted investigators to secure his possessions, restrict his movements, or require ongoing cooperation. He remained on campus. He remained enrolled. He walked the same pathways Kristin had walked, ate in the same dining halls, moved through the same spaces. In the years that followed the initial investigation, information about Flores' behavior toward women began to accumulate in ways that, had it been assembled into a single document, would have constituted a significant pattern. A woman reported that he had attempted to break into her apartment. Charges were not filed. Other incidents were reported through campus channels, referred to administrative processes, and resolved in ways that left no lasting record and created no lasting consequence. He had access to women. He had a history of incidents involving women. The incidents were documented. The documentation led nowhere. In November 1996, 6 months after Kristin disappeared, her family filed a civil wrongful death lawsuit against Paul Flores. Over the course of the deposition proceedings, Flores was asked directly and repeatedly about what had happened the night Kristin Smart was last seen. He invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. He did this 27 times, 27 questions, 27 refusals to answer. And the legal system, which is built to accommodate that silence, accommodated it. The civil lawsuit continued without his testimony. The criminal investigation, such as it was, continued without his cooperation. The years moved forward. Stan Smart drove to the Cal Poly campus on a weekend morning sometime in the late 1990s and walked the route from the party house on Crandall Way to Muir Hall. He walked it at night, the way his daughter would have walked it. He stood at the point where the pavement ended and the dormitory entrance began. He counted the distance in his head. He drove home and did not say much. Denise Smart still had the voicemail. She played it sometimes, not often. The voice on it was so ordinary, so completely certain that Sunday was going to arrive the same way every Sunday arrived. It had been years since Sunday arrived that way for the Smart family. The case file sat on the shelf and collected the particular kind of dust that settles on things that institutions have decided to stop looking at. Somewhere in California, Paul Flores built a life. And somewhere in California, the evidence of what he had done was still in the ground, waiting for someone who had not yet been born when Kristin Smart disappeared to think of a way to find it. Chris Lambert was 8 years old in the spring of 1996. He grew up on the central coast of California, in the same general geography where the case had unfolded, in the same regional memory that held Kristin Smart's name the way some communities hold the names of things they have not fully resolved. Present, recurring, never quite settled. He was not a detective. He had no law enforcement background, no forensic training, no access to privileged case materials. What he had was time, a recording setup, and the kind of patience that official investigations, which move in response to institutional pressure and resource allocation, do not always possess. In 2018 and into 2019, Lambert released a podcast called Your Own Backyard. The podcast was not an entertainment product. It was a documented reconstruction of the case, methodical, sourced, built from interviews with people who had been present at the party on Crandall Way in 1996 and who had, in the 23 years since, found no official channel that seemed interested in what they had seen or heard. Lambert gave them one. The audience response was immediate and substantial. People who had followed the case for years listened and shared it. People who had never heard of Kristin Smart listened and could not stop. But more significantly, and this was the development that changed the direction of the criminal investigation, witnesses listened. People who had been 19 and 20 years old the night Kristin Smart disappeared, who had gone home for the summer and built careers and families and adult lives while carrying things they had seen and heard, found in the podcast a reason to finally say them. One of those people was a woman named Jennifer Hudson. Hudson had known Paul Flores in the years following Kristin's disappearance. What she described when she came forward, his behavior, specific statements he had made, patterns she had observed, aligned with a picture of him that the initial investigation had sketched in outline but never developed into anything that could be used. Other women came forward as well. The accounts varied in their specifics but converged in their shape. Flores, in social settings, had a way of targeting, of isolating, of finding the moment when someone was vulnerable and positioning himself as the person who would help. The San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office had not closed the case entirely in the years the podcast ran. Investigators had continued working it, quietly and without the visibility that the early investigation had received. But the volume and quality of the new testimony generated by Your Own Backyard created something the case had not previously had. Witnesses who were ready to go on record, with enough specificity and corroboration to support the kind of legal action that requires more than a theory. In 2020, Investigators served a search warrant at Paul Flores' home in the Los Angeles area. The sheriff's office confirmed that items of interest had been recovered. They did not specify what those items were. Shortly after, cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar were deployed to a residential property in Arroyo Grande, the home of Ruben Flores, Paul's father. Investigators focused specifically on a section of soil beneath a wooden deck at the back of the house. The equipment registered something. It registered it clearly. The soil beneath that deck had been disturbed. The disturbance was consistent in dimension and in the biological markers detected, with remains having been buried there, and then, at some point, moved. Someone had put something in that ground, and then someone had decided it could not stay there. Paul Flores had lived freely for 25 years. He had watched the investigation circle his name without ever landing on it with enough force to hold. He had sat through a civil deposition and said nothing 27 times. He had built a quiet life in the Los Angeles area, 200 miles from the campus where Kristin Smart had walked 40 yards and disappeared. He had done all of this because, until 2019, nobody had given the witnesses a reason to speak. That reason now existed, and what those witnesses had to say was going to pull everything apart. The ground-penetrating radar did not lie. When investigators ran the equipment across the soil beneath the wooden deck at Ruben Flores' property in Arroyo Grande in the spring of 2021, the readings that came back were not ambiguous. There was disturbance in the earth. There were biological markers consistent with decomposition. The dimensions and depth of the disrupted area matched what forensic specialists described as consistent with a burial site. The cadaver dogs, working the same area independently, gave the same answer. Something had been in that ground. Something had been put there deliberately. And at some point, the forensic evidence suggested it was not recently, that something had been removed. Investigators had been working toward this point for years. The sheriff's office had never fully closed the Smart case, though the active investigation had ebbed and flowed through the decades in ways that corresponded more to available resources and political will than to any new development in the evidence. What the podcast had done, what Chris Lambert's patient, sourced, relentless documentation had done, was create enough external pressure and enough newly available testimony that the investigation had been able to build toward a legal threshold it had never previously reached. That threshold was an arrest warrant. Both men pleaded not guilty. This is the moment the entire case turned. 25 years of waiting, and it came down to what the ground remembered. If you have been watching this far, subscribe and turn on notifications right now, because what happens next in the courtroom is the part of this story nobody was certain would ever arrive. The case that followed was structured in a way that reflected how long and how carefully it had been built. Because Paul Flores and Ruben Flores faced distinct charges arising from distinct alleged conduct, the court seated two separate juries, one for the son, one for the father, who would hear the same trial simultaneously but deliberate independently. It was a logistical arrangement that acknowledged the complexity of a prosecution built not around a body, because Kristin Smart's remains had never been found, but around everything else. The forensic traces left in the soil, the testimony of women who had known Paul Flores in the years after 1996, the documented pattern of behavior that the initial investigation had noted and not pursued. The trial opened in the summer of 2022 in Monterey County, moved there on a change of venue motion given the depth of public knowledge of the case in San Luis Obispo County. Jennifer Hudson took the stand. She described what she had witnessed in her time knowing Paul Flores, his behavior, specific things he had said, the way he conducted himself around women in social settings. Her testimony was precise and detailed in ways that 23 years of silence had not diminished. Other women testified as well. The accounts were different in their specifics and consistent in their shape. The prosecution did not have a confession. They did not have remains. What they had was a case built the way cases are built when a suspect has had 25 years to ensure that nothing simple would be found. Through accumulation, through pattern, through the forensic memory of soil that holds information longer than human institutions hold attention. The jury had everything the original investigators had failed to gather in 1996. The question was whether it would be enough, and whether a verdict would mean anything to a family that still did not know where their daughter was. The verdict came back on October 18, 2022. His son did not. Denise Smart was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She had sat through the full trial, through the testimony, through the defense's arguments that the evidence was circumstantial and insufficient, through the weeks of procedural motion that separate the beginning of a trial from its end. When the word guilty was spoken, she did not immediately react in the way that courtroom scenes are often depicted. No collapse, no audible cry, no moment that could be filmed and understood without context. She sat still. Her hands were in her lap. The people around her exhaled in ways they had not allowed themselves to exhale in a very long time. Stan Smart gripped the arm of the chair beside him. They had been waiting for this day for 26 years. The day itself did not look the way waiting imagines it will. Paul Flores was sentenced on March 10, 2023. The sentence was 25 years to life in California State Prison. He was 46 years old. He was taken into custody and eventually transferred to the California State Prison at Corcoran, where he was subsequently attacked twice by other inmates using improvised weapons, information that entered the public record without comment from the Smart family. He did not, at sentencing or at any point before or after, disclose where Kristin Smart's remains were. He said nothing that helped the family find her. In October 2025, a California appeals court heard the arguments that Flores' legal team had assembled in the years since the conviction: claims of prosecutorial error, challenges to the forensic evidence, arguments that the admission of testimony about prior bad acts had denied him a fair trial. The appeals court reviewed the record and issued its decision. The conviction was affirmed. In January 2026, the California Supreme Court declined to hear a further appeal. Every door Flores' legal team had tried to open had closed. The conviction stood. The sentence stood. The silence about where Kristin Smart was buried stood with it. The Smart family received the news of each legal development with the particular kind of composure that belongs to people who have spent decades learning to receive information about their daughter's case without allowing it to undo them entirely. They had built a discipline around hope that most people never need. Every hearing, every ruling, every development in the legal process had required them to be present and functional in ways that grief alone does not prepare a person for. They had done it. Year after year, they had done it. And they still did not know where Kristin was. The system had delivered what it could deliver: a verdict, a sentence, a legal accounting for what Paul Flores had done. What the system could not deliver, what no conviction, no appeal outcome, no court ruling had the power to return, was the one thing the family had asked for since the spring of 1996. They asked for it still. There is a version of this story that ends with the guilty verdict and calls it justice. That version is not wrong. Paul Flores was convicted of killing Kristin Smart. He was sentenced to spend the rest of his functional adult life in prison. The legal system, which had failed to act with urgency in the spring of 1996, eventually did what it was built to do. A jury of his peers reviewed the evidence and found him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That is not a small thing. But the record of how this case actually unfolded does not allow for a clean ending, and the people who lived through it would not accept one even if it were offered. The failures in this case were not complicated. They were documented, repeated, and largely preventable. In the first days after Kristin Smart disappeared, campus police decided she had probably left voluntarily. Local law enforcement did not file a formal missing person report for 4 days. A suspect with visible injuries and a shifting account of events was identified and not treated as one. His dormitory room was not secured. His clothing was not collected. His injuries were not photographed. The 48-hour window in which physical evidence could have established with certainty what happened on Crandall Way that night was allowed to close without being used. That delay cost evidence that was never recovered. It cost 25 years of an investigation that should have concluded in 1996. It cost a family a quarter-century of not knowing where their daughter was. And it cost Kristin Smart something that no verdict can return: What broke the case open was not new forensic technology. The cadaver dogs and the ground-penetrating radar and the biological testing of the Arroyo Grande soil mattered enormously, but they mattered because someone had first created the conditions in which witnesses were willing to speak. Chris Lambert, working without a badge or a budget or institutional authority, gave people a reason and a place to say what they knew. The witnesses who came forward after the podcast was released had, in most cases, been willing to talk for years. They had simply not found anyone willing to listen in a way that felt like it might matter. That is the lesson the case leaves behind. Not that a podcast solved a murder, though in the precise sequence of events, that is closer to true than most institutions would be comfortable admitting. The lesson is that the gap between available information and acted upon information is not a gap filled by technology or resources. It is filled by attention, by the decision to take a witness seriously, by the choice to treat a missing young woman's disappearance as a crime from the first hour rather than from the fourth day. The Kristin Smart Campus Security Act has been in effect since 1998. The law exists because of what was done to her. It requires California's public colleges to formalize reporting agreements with local law enforcement to ensure that a student's disappearance is treated with the institutional weight it deserves from the moment it is reported. The law is real. It has been in effect for nearly 3 decades. Kristin Smart was 19 years old. She stood 5 feet 10 inches tall. She had decided, against her own doubts, to stay at Cal Poly. She had a makeup exam scheduled. She had called her parents on a Friday afternoon and left a voicemail that said, "Good news, and call you Sunday." She was walking 40 yards to her dormitory door when someone who had placed himself beside her decided that she would not reach it. Her body has not been found. Her family does not know where she is. Denise Smart still has the voicemail. Stan Smart still walks with the knowledge of what 40 yards looks like when you measure it by what your daughter lost on the way across it. The verdict gave them his name on a piece of paper with the word guilty beside it. It did not give them their daughter back. It did not tell them where she was. It did not answer the question they have been asking since the morning of May 25, 1996, when Sunday arrived and the phone did not ring. Kristin Smart deserved better from the first hour. She deserved to be found. She deserved a system that took her disappearance seriously before the evidence of it had time to disappear. She deserved all of this in 1996. And the fact that she received a measure of it in 2022 does not make the intervening 26 years less real or less costly. What it makes them is a record, a documented, irreversible record of what happens when the people responsible for protecting someone decide that she probably just went to Hawaii. If this case stayed with you, if it made you think about how long a family can carry hope, about the weight of what gets called justice versus what actually is, share this video. Kristin Smart's name should be known by more people than it is. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next story. Every case we cover here is a real person who deserved to be found. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your words keep these stories alive, and the families who are still searching need to know that someone out there is still paying attention.